to proceed, okay?
We have started now, so.
Yeah, let's wait like a few seconds. I see all participants increasing now, so we're by 146 in my computer, going up very quick. The number of participants keeps increasing, Luis, so maybe let's wait just one more minute to allow everybody to join and to not miss your opening remarks. The number keeps increasing, Luis, so we have over 300 participants now, so maybe another half minute, and then we start.
Sure.
Okay, Luis, I think we can kick off.
Perfect. Well, good morning or good afternoon to everyone. Dear speakers, dear participants, thank you very much for joining us today for this untypical ETC webinar on the impact of the Ukraine war on European tourism. We feel very honored to have you here, and it's a huge responsibility also to share with you the details that we have. We're facing uncertain and unprecedented times in European tourism, but we hope we will put with all our guests some light on what we see for the future. We have started our path to recovery following two very difficult years due to COVID-19. And now we face another huge crisis at the European borders. First of all, I have to say that ETC firmly stands in solidarity with Ukraine. We've been deeply shocked by the military invasion of Ukraine by the Russian government. And we have been stating that in all possible and by all possible means. We condemn this attack on freedom in Europe, and we call, of course, for the immediate restoration of peace. Our thoughts are with the Ukrainian people, our colleagues in Visit Ukraine, and our travel and tourism colleagues in Ukraine also, whose livelihoods have been destroyed. Travel is a force for peace, understanding, and respect. ETC has established 70 years ago, was established 70 years ago in the aftermath of World War II, and we remain steadfast in our commitment to ensuring travel continues to build bridges between different cultures and people. We praise also the efforts of our NTO members and the travel and tourism businesses all over the world, and especially here in Europe, for their solidarity. Nothing compared to this human suffering experienced by the Ukrainian people, but we also have to be mindful of the impact this war will have on the European economy and in the tourism sector. That's why we are organizing this webinar today, to assess the effects of the invasion of European tourism and to discuss future prospects in the next months. Needless to say that this crisis will cause another setback in the recovery of our European tourism, especially in Eastern European destinations. The conflict is causing a spike in energy prices, which will directly affect our operations, the cost of transportation and tourism services, while also threatening the trust and the confidence in traveling to Europe. Without any more delay, because we have a tight schedule, we will get started. It's my pleasure to first thank once again our partners, and I will give the floor to Mrs. Valentina Superti. Valentina is Director for Tourism at DG GROW in the European Commission. And Valentina will give us the first Commission's assessment of this conflict's impact on the tourism ecosystem, but also the European Union plans to mitigate it. Afterwards, we will follow with our partners from Tourism Economics, TCI Research and Forward Keys. They will share the most recent data and the impact analysis. We will have a question and answer session at the end, but first I will give the floor to Valentina, thanking you, Valentina, and all the speakers and all those who are attending. A huge thank you for this contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Luis and Eduardo, and for the invitation. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Thank you. Thank you again. And the invitation is unfortunately timely. I share fully your words of support for, in particular, the Ukrainian people who are going through so much suffering in this very moment. So your words of condemnation are also our words of condemnation. That being said, the topic today is the impact that this situation will have or is likely to have on the tourism ecosystem. It's always good to remember the figures, not because they are figures, but because they mean something. Tourism accounts for around 10% of GDP in Europe and 23 million jobs, direct and indirect jobs. So it's a big part of our economy, and it's a great contributor to wealth in Europe. And indeed, you mentioned that this ecosystem, so the tourism ecosystem was very hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, I want also to be optimistic, because the tourism ecosystem has shown that it is also able to bounce back well. What I mean is that before this situation now in Ukraine, there were already very good signs of recovery, and notably with very good winter results. So I also think this should be mentioned. That being said, of course, now this geopolitical situation clearly brings us a lot of uncertainty, and certainly a lot of challenges, more challenges ahead. I want here also to mention that this situation has mobilized Europe at all levels, But also in the tourism ecosystem, we have seen a lot of solidarity going on, and this is, I think, to be noted. And I want to thank the hospitality sector, but also the many transport operators who have been hosting refugees from Ukraine, and this is so much needed, and I think we need to thank all of these operators for what they are doing, and they will continue to do to help the people in trouble. Now, coming to the effects of the situation on tourism now, it is honestly quite difficult to make a sound prediction for us at this point in time. We are, by the way, launching soon a survey. So we will be launching a survey soon to get feedback. But of course, we will need more. What we can tentatively say, you said it already, Luis, there will be clearly a direct, there is already clearly a direct impact caused simply by the loss of Russia as an important source market for many European destinations. And clearly there will also be a direct impact for neighboring countries. Let's think of Finland, Estonia, Bulgaria, just to name a few. At the same time, we expect that regions that are further away from the conflict zone and which benefit from a large domestic market, so those regions might relatively be less affected from the situation, although everybody will suffer the indirect effects. What I call the indirect effects of energy rising prices and fuel costs, etc., which will impact everybody. And more generally, we know that most economists expect higher inflation, slower growth in the EU as a result of disruption in supply chains, the sanctions and the counter sanctions. So this is the overall picture, I am afraid. That being said, I again thank you for this seminar because I think it will be useful. So we are all ears, especially when it comes to those companies that are here who are specialized in tourism, forecasting, because I think we also need more data, more data and more precise forecasting that I think some of you will be able to give us. That being said, let me outline very briefly just a few things that we are already doing in the Commission. First of all, state aid temporary framework. So this will allow injection of support, including in the tourism ecosystem. There is already a framework which is applicable until June this year. But today, should be today, there will be a special regime, in a way, if you allow me the expression, rightly so generous framework for allowing more state aid in light of the situation in Ukraine specifically. So that will be adopted normally today or tomorrow. Secondly, we will keep working notably with you, ETC, on the promotion of Europe as a safe destination, because this is one of the indirect impacts, that Europe may be perceived as a less safe destination now because of this situation. So we need your help in that. And thirdly, third element, you know that we are working on a transition roadmap for tourism. And now, for me, the resilience dimension is even more important than before. So we will to work hard with all of you, all the stakeholders, to do more for a more resilient ecosystem. I think something I can already mention is, for example, the upskilling and the reskilling actions that we can put in place, notably to help, the Ukrainian refugees who may, with training, help, by the way, the skills shortages in the tourism sector. So here I would stop. I thank you again, and I really hope to learn a lot. We hope to learn a lot from you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valentina, and thank you for your support. I have to say to all those that are listening that for the first time, and thanks to the DG GROW and Commissioner Breton and Valentina, tourism is considered one of the 14 ecosystems of Europe. And this transition pathway will be, as you said, a very useful tool to build up the resilience of the tourism sector after these 2 years, and surely after this terrible war. So thank you once again for your cooperation, and count on ETC, and I think with every country and every tourism sector and every enterprise to help you on this endeavor. So thank you so much. I will give the floor now to Eduardo, who will introduce our guests and will take care of the debate. Thank you so much, Eduardo.
Thank you, Luis, indeed, and thank you, Valentina, for giving us the state of play from the European institutions. And I can only echo Luis' words of appreciation, and thanking also fully hearted our upcoming speakers, starting with David Goodger from Tourism Economics. Our speakers are going to give us different angles from tourism research, and David will be talking about the macroeconomic and travel impacts on of the invasion. So David, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Eduardo, and thank you indeed, Valentina and Luis. So we'll share my screen now, so hopefully you can see my content. And yes, I think I will be sharing some of the key themes that have already been mentioned here, looking through some of the key macroeconomic and travel effects that have already been discussed. And at times it feels like it is a relatively minor impact in everything when we look at the news, and we absolutely would agree with everything that has been said in terms of condemning the actions. But I have been asked here to talk on the economic and travel impacts of this crisis, and so I'll just share some quick thoughts on how we are revising the forecast that we produce at Tourism Economics and Oxford Economics. So talking through quickly 3 main themes. So first one, as was mentioned, so the direct impact that we do see, lost Russian travel, with no-fly zones, lingering sanctions, and we do expect there will be a lasting impact on the ruble, which will affect affordability. So these travel volumes that we were seeing in 2019 will not be regained anytime soon, if at all. That will put a dent in terms of this bounce back, in terms of that recovery of total European travel. It's also noteworthy, though, to see that, to support this, as we look at the size of this market in 2019, it was actually smaller than in 2014, when prior rounds of sanctions were imposed on Russia. It never regained. It was that hit to the ruble. It was that cost effect, meant that some of these numbers were smaller than they were earlier. But still, not getting back to this will have some large impacts for a wide range of destinations, as we can see. Turkey stands out, large volumes, but a lot of these other European and non-European markets had a relatively high reliance of travel on Russia. Possibly a greater concern in all of this would be, what these wider impacts of the sanctions might mean on wider economic impact, what this will happen to incomes and the expected consumer-led recovery. Anyone who's seen me do any of the presentations of this sort over the past couple of years will be, hopefully familiar with the terms, the consumer-led recovery, pent-up demand, enforced savings. During the pandemic, people weren't able to get out and spend as they wanted to. They did save, and we expected that to really drive this recovery once all the pandemic restrictions were lifted. We still expect a large impact on that, but it's the higher costs, rising oil costs, rising other inflation costs will erode some of that and lead to some slower growth. So there's a snapshot of our world GDP forecasts looking by quarter. Q1, you can see very weak. This was impacted by Omicron wave, all of the restrictions in place hitting activity. Our February forecast, we did expect a relatively rapid rebound around the world in those red bars. That has been eroded by the crisis, by the war in Ukraine. Reasons for this, it is the inflation, it is the higher prices eroding those incomes, eroding those savings, making everything more expensive, and notably for travel, making that travel, those higher fares, more expensive. So on this left-hand chart, we can see how our expectations for GDP growth this year have evolved, and also how our expectations for inflation have also evolved. Middle of last year, we're expecting over 4.5% GDP growth. By February, with some of the supply chain issues, this had come down to about 4% growth expectation. Now in our latest forecast, it's down to 3.4% inflation. At the same time, those inflation numbers have been going up. The costs have been rising, which will undermine any of that possible consumer-led growth. Possibly the good news, though, on all of this, the silver lining, is that we do expect that this is peaking this year. The chart on the right showing our latest expectations for that CPI inflation worldwide. And this is true in most regions and countries. We do expect that to be coming down over the next couple of years. It will be peaking this year. For travel costs, that there might be a bit more of a lag on that, as it takes time for all these effects to feed through, but still we do expect this to fade over time. How much this will affect different regions? Clearly, Russia is going to be hardest hit. We can see that the red part of these bars shows our baseline impact, so how much we've changed our GDP forecasts relative to the pre-conflict expectations. We can see Russia most heavily hit, then European destinations, notably Eurozone, the GDP effect coming down, which will affect intra-regional travel as well as that direct travel from Russia, and other destinations, US, Asia, some smaller impacts, but there would still be notable impacts. This is, of course, then our baseline, but there is, worst case scenarios. We run a lot of different alternative scenarios, and we can see that there is a plausible downside where we see much tighter sanctions, much longer scale conflict, sanctions lasting, Russian counter sanctions, retaliation, including cuts to the gas supply, and that would give this much larger impacts, which would effectively erode all of the growth that we're seeing in our baseline for Eurozone and other markets, so would be enough to push us back into recession, which would have large impacts on the forecast. But that is our worst case. Final thing just to mention briefly would be sentiment effects have been mentioned. We do believe that people will still see Europe as a safe destination in general. Some of the closer destinations to Russia will have some impacts from sentiment, but we do see limited evidence of this to date for Europe as a whole. And this is true looking here at a longer run historical view, where we see in previous sort of crises events such as the Kosovo War, annexation of Crimea, terrorist attacks in Europe. These are the areas that are shaded in grey. We saw slowdown in travel from US to Europe as an example, and notably a dip slower than general US outbound, but it wasn't large scale falls. We do see that resilience in this demand, which we expect to see in this crisis. There will be some effects, some large effects in some destinations, but general demand will be supported. That pent-up demand will be allowed. So just to finish off, here is a snapshot of our latest forecast. So on the right, we can see how much we're revising our forecasts for the coming years for travel to Europe, international travel. This includes the long-haul travel to the region as well as intra-regional. Largest hits to some Eastern European destinations, but other effects for Western Europe will fade over time, and for other destinations around the world, which does mean recovery is sadly deferred, but not totally derailed. We were previously expecting 2024 to be the year we regained 2019 levels worldwide. That has been pushed back a year, and notably in some destinations, including in Eastern European destinations. But for other places in Europe, Western Europe, we do still see recovery by 2024, and some large strides still to be made this year, although slightly less than we had previously hoped. Finish at that point.
Thank you so much, David, for this comprehensive analysis. I will come back to you during the debate on the impact of the higher energy costs for the distribution and value chain. So we see the impacts already in many countries that, even some shelves are starting to be empty, and that would obviously have an impact, a spillover effect on tourism enterprises like hotels and other entities. We'll continue the presentation now with TCI Research, Mr. Olivier Henry Diot. Olivier, you're going to give us the another angle of the crisis. The title of your presentation is Conflicts Impact the Travel Sentiment and Destinations Reputation. So exactly what David was mentioning at the end of his presentation. How is this crisis going to be impacting in the reputation and travel sentiments for Europe?
Yes, hi Eduardo, and hi everyone. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that as we speak, it's probably the first time in the recent history of travel that we measure such a gap between a very strong desire to travel after like 2 years of frustrations on the one hand, and a lot of complexity for organizing and planning a trip abroad. And so this is kind of explaining why it's so important to have a track and keep an eye on destination reputation, including all these external non-tourism factors, health, COVID, and today geopolitics, because basically consumers are really looking for choosing the destination they trust, can offer them the full experience in, of course, the safest environment. So to do that, basically one way, probably the best way, is to just listen to what people are saying. When I say people, it could be the medias or companies, consumers. So all this big noise on social conversations are telling us a lot about the destination reputation. And of course, the reputation and the sentiment is never alone predictive of travel planning or booking. But basically, if your reputation as a destination is better than your neighbors, you have probably more chance to be selected in the near future. So technically, we use a bit of a complex algorithm, so to track the facts and also to track the emotions of what people are saying in relation to the destination. And from that, we try to understand the positivity and the negativity. And you will see that basically not everything is negative as we speak. Before I give you an update on the very recent, let's say, change in the overall sentiment and reputation, I just would like to remind all of us that, like 4 to 5 weeks ago, just before Russia decided to invade Ukraine, the Russian people used to be ambassadors of Europe for many of them. They had Europe as the #1 destination in mind for a next trip this year, and I have to thank Visit Britain for giving me the permission to use that survey, which is not published yet. It's just like they did a few weeks ago. So they had Europe on top of mind, and it's true to say that actually Russia used to be the most satisfied markets in Europe. And very ironically, Russians in the same survey told us that they had a bit of concern about local attitudes. So what I'm trying to say is, of course, we are all supporting Ukraine, but it's not like, a football match, and there's a lot of complexity over there. And in the long term, we need to remember that the Russian market will come back maybe in 6 months, maybe in 6 years, most probably in 6 years. But there couldn't be more worst case scenario if we hear a bit of anti-Russian or Russian hate developing, just like we had a bit of anti-China resentment when the COVID crisis started 2 years ago. Having said that, today, when we look at how far the conversations are impacted, of course, we have more or less a third of social conversations about travel in Europe that somehow refer to the Ukraine crisis. This is a lot, of course. This is more than the way it impacts all the destinations in the world. But having said that, it also means there are 2/3 of conversations about travel in Europe which are not referring to this, keeping the reputation high, and in many cases in a very positive way. And if we compare with 2 years ago, when we had the start of the crisis of COVID, we have something like 50, sometimes 70% of social conversations about Europe travel that were populated by the crisis. So somehow this is important, but we see some resilience. And at the end of the day, when we measure the polarity of social conversations about Europe, this indicator is showing the balance between positive and negative posts and comments about Europe. You see there that the current situation is showing, of course, a drop and a decline, like 50 points compared to pre-COVID average, Ukraine conflict average. But 28 means that there are still more positive than negative mentions. And also, this is more or less the kind of level we had like a year ago after the new COVID variants conversations growing. And it is far, maybe not better, but not so worse compared to the dramatic decline we had at the start of the COVID crisis. Because basically, and there are a lot of drivers of positivity, I hope I will have time to explain when we discuss after, but it's very different compared to COVID 2 years ago, because at that time, the enemy was kind of unknown and very invisible. And deciding 2 years ago to travel was kind of rolling the dice, and you had a very good chance to be exposed to the virus and contaminated. But today, if I decide to go tomorrow to Bratislava or Helsinki, I mean, the chance for me to be killed by the Russian army is just like close to 0%. So this is impacting quite sharply, but not at the magnitude that we could expect compared to some other crises, for example. Then, of course, in terms of competitiveness, needless to say that Europe currently have a bit of, is a bit at risk compared to some of the regions. The level of positivity has been impacted more than, for example, in Asia Pacific or in the Middle East. But it's important to track per market. And in this case, we are seeing that the impact of reputation of Europe is kind of a bit global, including in the intra-European markets. But basically, the market which seems to be more exposed to negativity or sharing negativity about Europe is more North America. So minus 17 points. Having said that, again, this is not a huge impact right now. So it means all the conversations over there are more about, okay, is it time maybe to postpone, or, people are questioning about, is it safe or not to go back to Europe, more than just massively canceling and giving advice to completely stop any travel to Europe. In terms of destination, and this is probably one of the slides that you would expect, we are measuring the impact of reputation for various destinations across Europe. And just like we could have expected, the closer you are to the areas where the conflict is developing, the more your reputation is kind of impacted. So that includes, of course, the Baltic countries, some of the countries neighboring Ukraine or Russia. Sometimes not so close, but having strong historical relationship with Russia, such as Cyprus, for example. But some of the positive news, or let's say re-entering news, is that the big names, thinking about France, Italy, Spain, Greece, are currently not so much impacted in their reputation. And so we don't find any evidence that the Germans for next summer are going to cancel their usual sun and sea trip in Spain or in Greece. So it's really more related to how far you're exposed to the geography and the risk associated to that. And even though there are many aspects that are able to maintain the good reputation of some destinations across Europe. So I would like to say that obviously, I mean, what's going on is bad. It's bad for the image. It's definitely something that is adding on top of potential new waves of COVID and everything. But somehow, as we speak, and depending on how the conflict is going to escalate or not, and possibly being resolved in the coming months, the thing is, looking at the social sentiment, this is giving us a bit of, careful optimism. People are getting mature, including in the US market, about what is the risk they can take today traveling to Europe. So you have, mentions like there's a growing conversation about, is it ethical to travel today where people are in war? And people may say, okay, unless you are part of the Ukrainian resistance, there is no reason to be too shame about traveling to Europe today. And other people saying, okay, why are you asking advice about if you should go to Germany? Because Germany or Netherlands are nowhere near Ukraine. So there's a bit of maturity and a lot of question marks that needs to be addressed, but somehow not so much of a huge impact if we compare maybe to terrorism attacks or more invisible threats like COVID. Today the enemy has a face, so to speak. So it's a bit less easier for people to plan based on that. So I don't want to be too optimistic, but somehow there are some reasons for hope in the near future.
Thank you so much, Olivier, for these incredible insights on reputation and also sentiment, which we know are very subjective, but this is after all what make people go in one direction or the other. We'll continue here a round of experts with Mr. Olivier Ponty from Forward Keys, and Olivier will be giving us the latest data on flight bookings to Europe. Olivier, the floor is yours.
Hi, Eduardo. Hi, everybody. Pleasure to be here with you today. And thanks to our friends at ETC. Could you please confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes, and we can hear you.
That's perfect. All right. So we're going to share some insights about the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict on European tourism, but as seen from above, from the perspective of air travel. For those of you who do not know Forward Keys, we're a travel analytics company specializing in air travel, and we use the most comprehensive data sets on air capacity, searches, bookings, and tickets issued to monitor the evolution of air travel in near real time. In today's analysis, we'll be mainly covering the first 2 weeks of the conflict. And I'd like to start with some brief comments on the loss of the Russian source market for the EU and the UK. To be fair, it's a market that's been missing for a while, as David already mentioned earlier. And that's because of travel restrictions across the EU, which have not permitted a recovery from the crisis started by COVID-19. For a proper rebound of Russian travel to Europe, the recognition by the EU of the Sputnik vaccine is a must, and it just didn't happen, even prior to the invasion of Ukraine. Now, when the EU closed its airspace to Russian airlines, we could still see Russian travelers using Serbia as a backdoor to enter the EU and reach destinations like Cyprus, France, Switzerland, or Italy. But this trend has now stopped as Serbia reduced its flight services. Bookings dropped from 24% of 2019 levels prior to the invasion to close to 0%. So the question is, who's going to suffer the most from this situation? And one way to answer this question is to look at the destinations with the highest share of Russian bookings in their guest mix in the last few months. And here we can see several coastal destinations in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, which are likely to be heavily affected because of their strong reliance on Russian travelers. This is the case for Rimini in Italy and for several destinations in Bulgaria and Cyprus. Now, we should also expect specific travel businesses like travel retail or duty-free operators to suffer from the lack of high-end shoppers coming from Russia. So it's not only sun and sea destinations that will be in pain, but also in European metropolises, specific travel businesses which used to offer attractive shopping experiences to Russian travelers. The next question we need to answer is whether the war in Ukraine is having a negative impact on intra-European travel. And this is even more important considering that so far, intra-European travel has been the backbone of the travel recovery. And to this question, we must answer that there's been a negative impact as the start of the war has put the brake on a recovery trend that looked very promising. Just before the invasion, new tickets issued for an intra-European trip had reached almost 80% of their 2019 levels. And in the following 2 weeks, this dropped to between 65 and 70%. This hurts, but it is a somewhat limited impact given the seriousness of the crisis. And most importantly, there is no indication of a further decrease after the initial shock. Better than that, the recovery is still underway for key travel periods for the leisure segment. In the 2 weeks following the invasion, the Easter outlook has kept on improving, with bookings being only 22% behind 2019 levels against minus 28% before the war. And the summer outlook has also slightly improved and is currently 27% behind. So the resilience of intra-European travel is a good piece of news for the sector. Another comforting piece of news is that transatlantic travel seems to hold a firm grip. Bookings from the US had very strongly reactivated prior to the invasion as travel restrictions were lifted, and dropped from 86% to 74% of 2019 levels in the week the war started. Since then, it's come back to pre-war levels, showing that there's still strong demand on these strategic and profitable routes. On the supply side, airlines are still planning a progressive return to pre-COVID air capacity. They did not report any significant readjustment of capacity to the EU and the UK since the beginning of the war. As you can see on this chart, there is hardly any difference between pre-war schedules in yellow and wartime schedules in blue. I'd like to finish by looking at the impact of the war beyond the EU and the UK so that we can put the figures we've seen in a broader big picture perspective. Looking at the booking evolution in the first 2 weeks of the war, we can see very different situations across the continent. Now, basically, and simplifying a bit, the closer a country is to Russia, Ukraine, or Belarus, the heavier the impact on booking levels. Baltic countries, Hungary, or Bulgaria have experienced between 30 and 50% decrease in bookings. At the same time, most countries in Western and Northern Europe were experiencing less than 10% decrease. Geography clearly is a key factor. Another point I'd like to make is that the drop in bookings to the Eastern European destinations could be temporary, as people are waiting to see how the situation in the region evolves before making a booking. Travel intent is still there, as we can see on this chart, showing flight searches from Germany for a future trip to Poland. Part of these bookings may still come later, and it will very much depend on how long the war lasts and how it evolves. One thing is clear, though, the European travel sector at large is already paying the price for this conflict, as its competitive situation is deteriorating. When looking at the 7% decrease in international bookings to the continent since the beginning of the war, that's excluding Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, we should keep in mind that at the same time, all other regions were improving. 4 takeaways to conclude. 1, destinations dependent on Russian travelers and destinations close to the zone of conflict will face the hardest hit. 2, intra-European travel is holding, and bookings for the Easter and summer holidays keep growing. 3, transatlantic travel is back, which is good for many European cities. And 4, there is still pent-up demand, but the duration of the conflict and the way it evolves will define to which extent travel intent converts into bookings. Therefore, we need to remain very cautious and hope for a swift end to this war. So thank you for your attention. Feel free to connect on LinkedIn and visit our website to learn more on our DMO solutions. Thank you. Back to you, Eduardo.
Merci, Olivier. Thank you so much to Forward Keys also for sharing your insights, and thank you also for your takeaways there and conclusions, which are very, very important for us now to consider for next steps. I would like to continue now with the debate. I have prepared some questions for our distinguished speakers, but if the audience would like to address any questions to the speakers too, please feel free to use the Q&A button on Zoom. I will start with David. David, and I referred to these questions before, after your presentation. So after 2 years of disrupted travel due to COVID-19 travel restrictions, we expected this to be the year of recovery, but there is a cloud of uncertainty over international travel, triggered, of course, by the Ukrainian war. How could that hard travel recovery, also considering the refugee crisis, and more specifically, how do you expect higher energy prices to be passed on to consumers and travelers?
Yeah, I think the key part of that is the pricing side of things. That is going to be the key transmission that we're seeing from this crisis into affecting the wider economy, eroding some of that income, some of those savings, and how will then ultimately affect that spending on travel. So yeah, how that pricing comes through is absolutely crucial. Probably the bit I didn't touch on in much detail in the presentation would be then, specifically those energy prices, how that goes into fuel costs, and yes, ultimately it will affect airfares, and I think we have to expect this to feed through almost 100%. We know a lot of the, certainly the airlines or the transportation companies are, operating on, very thin margins. They've accumulated huge debt over the past couple of years. They've been able to survive, which is the great news throughout the pandemic. There's not been many airline failures. So there are the companies there. It's just they have large amounts of debt to pay down. They don't have huge margins that they can eat into. So unfortunately, these prices will have to feed through. It's a matter of timing. There's quite often a lag that we see in this because of some of the fuel purchase agreements. So this year, maybe more going into next year, we can expect to see some higher airfares, and that is something that we do expect to be, part of the reason why we have downgraded our forecast. I don't know if you noted on the chart that we showed that the downgrade is roughly the same size for 2023 as it is for 2022 because of these deferred price impacts.
Thank you, David. I would like to move now to Olivier Henry with regards to reputation issues. As you know, ETC focuses, actually as every other DMO, we focus on reputation, branding, also to position our destinations, around the globe. Olivier, we could see that the general score of reputation for Europe has declined, but it is also showing some signs of resilience. How would you explain this? To what can we attribute this particularly? And in your opinion, what aspects of European tourism attractiveness should be carefully managed in this context?
Yeah, probably there are, as always with sentiment, a lot of combination of different factors. So it's difficult to just point out one or two, but probably one of the reasons why currently the sentiment is relatively protected, so to speak, is because the pre-conflict or pre-crisis level of demand and desire for traveling is so strong that probably it leads now that, in terms of behaviors, people are more kind of adapting. They want to travel. So they are more into adapting, maybe changing a bit their plans, maybe a bit postponing, but the geopolitical factor usually has a very bad impact when the demand is fragile, and it's not the case today. So kind of, consumers are becoming more and more mature in assessing the risk and everything, getting informed. So because the demand is very high, this is resistance. Also inherently, and that's maybe a bit weird to hear that, but there are a lot of inherent positive images and social content associated to this current crisis. And one aspect about Europe is Europe has been portrayed all over the world as a very unified, very kind of a friendly community, opening their doors, opening their hearts to the refugees. There's been a lot of solidarity in the travel sector, a lot of flexibility. So many positive aspects, including people sharing on the Ukraine tourism treasures and making links with your other European attractive treasures in terms of culture, etc. Lots of contacts between local Europeans and people abroad advising about, and reassuring about the trip planning and everything. So inherently, even if it's very bad overall, there are some element of positivity. And then I mentioned that 1/3 of social conversation referred to the crisis. So it means there are 2/3 of posts which continue to refer to very positive aspects in relation to the destination reputation, including creative cities and outdoor and events and sustainability or innovation. So everything is a matter of balance. And currently the balance is a bit more negative than before, but still positive in absolute values.
Thank you, Olivier. I would like also to ask Olivier Ponty from Forward Keys a question related to the US markets, as you were giving us there a silver lining in the cloud. While you were practically very, very positive thinking about that, I would like to deepen in that knowledge. As you know, ETC has been focused in the United States for decades now, and it is by far the most important long-haul market for Europe. So how do you think this evolving the situation? We see also contradictory reports from media outlets and people really seeing Europe as a risky place to visit, some not, depending on West Coast, East Coast, and which media outlet is also reporting about. So do you think the ongoing conflict will refrain US flight booking to Europe overall in the long term, or this will just be concentrated in certain European regions? So are we going to be just seeing Americans coming to just one part of Europe, or you think things will get better over time?
I think there's several ways to look into this. First of all, let me reiterate that transatlantic travel is healthy in spite of the current situation. That's something which is really a very, very positive development. There's still strong pent-up demand after more than 2 years of COVID, and now is the time when this pent-up demand is released. So I think that for European destinations, one of the key to success is to make sure that they remain open for business for North American travelers. So that's one of the prerequisites for being able to bounce back and capitalize on this pent-up demand from the US. I think the most dangerous moment was really that week when the invasion started, because we could see this in the data. People were still booking, but there was a drop in booking because most people were waiting to see how the situation would evolve, and they've realized that a lot of destinations across Europe were safe. That actually destinations across Europe were safe unless they were directly involved into the conflict. So I don't see why all of a sudden the fears would rise again, and why we would see a further drop than what we've seen so far. So I think there's good potential, and again, it's key for destinations to remain open for business. The other part of the answer is, how about supply? Do airlines believe in this potential? And what we can see again at this stage is that airlines anticipate this demand to continue, and this is why they're building back capacity, hoping to bring capacity back to 2019 levels by the beginning of the summer.
And sorry, I have to tackle an issue here, because you mentioned the word capacity, and we see that capacity now has to be redistributed, because we also are lacking traffic from China. Also, Asian traffic has been completely rerouted. So do you see that capacity increase being a fact already been happening from what you see in your data, that both European and North American airlines are starting to increase capacity for this summer?
Yes, very clearly. So we're on the right path here.
Thank you so much. All right. I have another question for David with regards to the pressure on inflation, because obviously this is going to affect energy prices, but everything else too. Obviously the hotel has to serve food. Food will be more expensive. If food is more expensive, the price of the room will maybe increase too, and so on and so on. So this is a domino effect that cannot be avoided. Let's see, how can we relieve this, David? So what do you think that governments can do, to relieve this incredible pressure on travel and tourism? Would any of this support measure taken during COVID pandemic be useful again? Like, do you see things happening as grant, like special credit lines from states, or how do you see that from your perspective?
Well, in answer to the question of whether it would help, then absolutely, yes, it will. We're not seeing any of this support coming yet, but that's not to say it won't come. But it's something I think the industry does need to make clear, that there is this pressure. We've not recovered from from the COVID pandemic yet. That's something we've long been saying, that it's not a full recovery until tourism sector's recovered, because it has been so hard hit. So it is something that, yes, we need to talk to governments as a sector and try and get some of this support, some of this extra credit, some of the tax relief, the VAT relief that has helped individuals, helped businesses. Some of that would absolutely be welcome to get the sector through this time. I think the one other thing that would help, that is actually becoming more evident now, is some more coordinated action, just to help some of these sentiment factors that we keep talking about. If people have that confidence to travel, that they will get out and travel, particularly intra-regionally. Because of some of these cost factors, we will see some continued domestic travel. We will see more of the intra-regional rather than the long haul. That will remain important. But just to really help promote that, we need to take a standardized view, everyone stand together and make it really clear, simple rules on how you can cross borders, how you can travel around the region, just to boost that confidence and maybe offset some of these other factors that are out there.
Thank you, David. That leads me to a next question for Olivier Henry, with regards to the marketing efforts that maybe we all have to do, also in solidarity for those. You talk about the importance of proximity to the conflict and the effects on reputation. Which actions and messages target international and also intra-European source markets could help reviving this consumer confidence to travel to Europe this summer? And you mentioned that there's not much risk from Germany to Spain, or from north, the classic exodus north to south in the summer. But what about our colleagues from the east part of Europe, and how can we do a better job helping them?
Yeah, sure. I think just like in any other type of crisis, there are two things which is with common sense to do. The first is more like about informing, and particularly if you are based or operating in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe is kind of growing in conversations as a concept which is confusing many different things. So being very objective and very clear about informing on potential travel frictions and all the logistics for potential travelers to your destinations, in terms of borders, what is closed, what is open, doing a bit of education about geographies, securing also about the prices. There are lots of growing conversations about the pricing, and if I take a package today, is it going to increase, and what about the cost of visiting and everything? The volatility is also something to get to provide reinsurance. Also the impact on the experience. So typically, if I plan to go to Prague or to Poland today, what is maybe potentially restricted? Are there any events cancelled? If I am like luxury brand lovers, will I find my favorite luxury brands in Paris? And what about also living together with refugees? Can I help? Some other would say maybe there is an extra risk with COVID or whatever. This is the way people think. So everything around travel frictions, informing. So it's not about promoting, but it's more like informing. And then keeping the desire for Europe, just as always in times of crisis. First of all, making sure that people do not enter into this travel is not ethical today. It is ethical, and on the contrary, I mean, the message about travel is kind of a peacemaker. So yeah, come to Europe, enjoy. And if you can, and if you wish, you can help as well. You can show your solidarity to the Ukrainian people if you like. And then continuing promoting on super specific passion-based tourism, like art and culture, food, sport, nature, will help, escaping a bit the anxiety of all these war-related conversations. Probably we would suggest that there could be an accent on the culture and, the promotion of cultural exchanges and multicultural kind of experiences when you travel in Europe. So, I mean, basically, there's nothing better today in terms of image when you have, for example, a classic concert with a local artist playing together with a Ukrainian artist, which may be a refugee. So things about, sharing, learning, and fundamentally the DNA of Europe. You can also use some influencers, ambassadors, so European people living abroad that can help giving credible information about the potential risk or not in the country to visit. And at the end of the day, that it might be tempting for some destination in Europe not to hide a bit, let's say, the anchorage to Europe, but on the contrary, we see the positive sentiment right now is showing the unified Europe, so like proud to be in Europe, rather than maybe trying to hide a bit that assuming maybe this is not so positive to be somewhere in Europe today. So this is, you know, some of the aspect, and the more specific, the more you are looking at specific segments, the better you can connect people together, sharing the same passion for specific experiences.
Thank you for that invaluable advice. We are unfortunately running out of time. I would like to express a huge token of appreciation to our distinguished speakers before passing the floor to our president, Luis Araujo, for his closing remarks. And also, I would like to communicate to the audience that all presentations, thanks to the presenters, will be shared on our website, so you will be able to download there. And the questions that haven't been answered from the Q&A, we'll try to answer them in written form, also in form of a document on the website. Luis, your closing remarks, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eduardo. And first of all, let me thank both Olivier and David, and of course, Valentina, for the participation. Thank you so much to all those who have attended this webinar. These are very challenging times, as you have seen, and very difficult to predict anything related with our activity. We're still facing and taking care of the wounds of these 2 past years, but we are clearly committed in showing the world, first, that tourism is a force for peace and for good, and second, that Europe is resilient, and we will also overcome this and have a successful year still if we work together. And I think this is my final message. We've seen this inside the European Travel Commission with the commitment of every state member and every NTO in order to not only coordinate a collective answer, but share our experiences in terms of the future of tourism inside Europe, but most important, in telling the world that this is not acceptable, that we need to put a stop to this war, and we need to start traveling again. Thank you all so much. We are very hopeful for the future, that's for sure. And I thank Eduardo and all the team at the European Travel Commission for putting this together. Thank you so much, Eduardo. And I hope that the next webinar will be related with something much more positive and much more agreeable and at least peaceful for the future of tourism in Europe. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.